Welcome everyone to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. It's a real privilege to have with us this morning Rev Jim Griffiths from the Church in Wales. You'll recall that not too long ago we published some information about a decision which has been taken by the Church in Wales to support same-sex marriages with a blessing, and we thought we'd get Jim on the channel just to discuss that. So first of all, Jim, would you like to say hello?
Hi, thank you so much, Tony, for having me. It's great to be with you.
Jim, honestly, the privilege is really all ours. I wonder if we could start just briefly. You are a vicar of a local church in Cardiff. Would you just like to tell us where you're from and what you're doing there?
Yes, that's right. So originally I'm from London, but we found ourselves in Wales. I came down in 2015 where I did my curacy in a church towards the centre of Cardiff. And then 2 years ago, I became vicar of a church in Lisvane, which is on the north side of Cardiff, just sort of on the outskirts. So I've been here for 2 years, most of it, of course, spent with during lockdown, all sorts of COVID restrictions, but it's been a good time.
Could you tell us just firstly, how does the Church in Wales relate to the Church of England, the Anglican, the overall Anglican ministry?
Globally, there is what's called an Anglican communion, and the Anglican communion consists of various provinces. Church in Wales is a province of the wider Anglican communion. So it's sort of, you could say, a sister church to the Church of England, and the Church of England in some senses is seen as the senior church within the Anglican communion.
Coalition for Marriage, we have supporters whose backgrounds are from all faiths and none, all different traditions, and indeed, as I say, lots of people who don't have any faith tradition whatsoever. What brings us together is the belief that there's something special about the lifelong union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others, and that we believe society needs to protect and preserve that because in many ways, it is the stabilising bedrock of society. And we're noticing today that it's right at the heart of many of the cultural debates that are taking place. Can you tell us, Jim, something happened recently in the Church of Wales and they approved a change? Could you tell us a little bit about what happened?
The governing body, which is the Church in Wales's legislative body, the decision was taken to pass a bill introducing a rite which allows, for the first time in the Church in Wales, the blessing of same-sex civil partnerships and civil marriages. So civil partnerships and civil marriages that have taken place outside the church in Wales, of course, but they can now be blessed in the church. The rite itself can be used from the 1st of October onwards, and it's what's called an experimental rite, which means that it's got a 5-year shelf life, after which time it'll go back before governing body and they will then decide what to do, whether to continue with the rite. I think in all likelihood, they will of course continue to do that, although they may make some changes to it. The other important thing to note is that there is a conscience clause. So clergy are not required to officiate at a same-sex blessing if they don't want to.
Can you tell us, for those who are uninitiated, what does a blessing mean?
That's a very good question. What is a blessing? I think essentially a blessing is a prayer asking for God's favor on something or someone. So in this case, asking for God's favor on a same-sex union. Now, if you ask, well, what does this blessing actually look like in practice? Well, it is found in the context of a service. So when governing body passed the legislation, they also introduced some liturgy, the liturgy for a service. And there are a couple of variations of the blessing that can be given in the course of that service. Just to give you an example of one of the blessings, it calls on God to strengthen the covenant between the couple to bind their lives together in love. The service itself will, of course, consist of prayers and vows and so on, but the blessing is really the heart of it. I think what's really important to understand is the significance of that theologically. Some people may have heard of Geoffrey John. Geoffrey John was until very recently the Dean of St Albans, and he said that the most important thing about the blessing service is its theological meaning, because the blessing by the church defines a gay relationship as a gift from God rather than a sin. And that really is the significance of the blessing. In fact, the BBC had a very good article on the governing body's decision, and they said the change is significant because a blessing in theological terms signifies God's approval. And so that really highlights the significance of the step that the Church in Wales has taken. When you look at the rite itself, it involves the blessing and exchanging of rings. It involves vows being exchanged or made, including repeating the vows you've used in the civil.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah. It involves the making of a covenant, just like marriage, and it involves the blessing of a union. So to a casual observer, this is going to look just like marriage. And then the other thing kind of linked to that is then the theological difference between marriage and same-sex blessing. Of course, to introduce same-sex marriage would be a much more explicit change than introducing blessing. But what the Church in Wales have done is that they have already conceded that same-sex marriage is a legitimate possibility, because they've already allowed the blessing of it by doing this. So in their explanatory memorandum, they talk about having a serious discussion about same-sex marriage when the time comes. But actually, by passing this legislation, they've undercut the whole.
It's default, isn't it? Really, it really is default. They've already said it's approved by God, and it's interesting how it is a trial period of 5 years. So at the end of it, theoretically, were it not to be accepted, does God suddenly become unhappy with those unions again, or what?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, of course, the reason why it's been introduced as a 5-year experimental rite is, I think, just to make it easier to pass.
So why would you say that's something different to other changes that the church may have adopted? So I know in the debate, questions came up, we've accepted divorce, we don't stone people for adultery anymore. So isn't this just another departure, a contemporary departure from the biblical passages?
Yes, well, I would say that actually the biblical moral teaching is consistent from Genesis, first book of the Bible, right through to Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. It simply doesn't change. And the pattern in relation to marriage is set actually as early as the 2nd chapter of the Bible, Genesis 2. We find the pattern for sexual relationship is in the context of a lifelong union between a man and a woman. And in the New Testament, Jesus himself affirms that that is the pattern. Both Old Testaments and New Testaments prohibit same-sex relationships. And so what we find is actually the same sexual ethic runs throughout the whole of the Bible. And if we look back at the last 2,000 years of church history, we find actually it is the foundation of the teaching of the church as well. So what about things then like stoning and divorce? Well, I think the key thing is this, that those things do not change the nature of the permitted relationship. In both cases, however you sort of grapple with those issues, the nature of the relationship is the same. It is a lifelong union between a man and a woman. Now, in relation to divorce is actually permitted in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament. It is permitted on narrow grounds. Jesus in the New Testament makes very clear what those grounds are. It is an exception. It's an accommodation to our sinful, fallen state. I think what's happened in the church is that it has moved away from the biblical teaching on divorce and remarriage. And so that does then open the way for people to come along later and say, well, look, the church has moved away from the clear teaching of the Bible on this issue. Why can't we do it on this issue? But two wrongs don't make a right. I think we need to go back and correct our error in relation to divorce and remarriage rather than introduce other changes.
And I think that's the principle, isn't it? That any change to that pattern, that's not to say that other types of relationships can't exist in a democratic society. We're not a theocracy, but nevertheless, the thing about marriage is that it describes what only one man and one woman can do. And it describes that covenant that takes place and everything that's involved in that, which cannot be replaced with any other type of relationship, if you like. Does that make people who agree with you homophobic, would you say?
Absolutely not. No, everyone is loved and unconditionally accepted by the church. It's very clear that Jesus's love is unconditional. There is a welcome for all, regardless of sexual orientation. And the church should express that same love. But we need to make a distinction between sexual orientation and sexual activity. And it's sexual activity at which we draw the line. So no, we're certainly not homophobic in any sense. There is a love and unconditional acceptance of gay people, but that does not require the approval of same-sex sexual activity. But then that's true for everyone. That's true for everyone, gay or straight. So at our church, we should treat a cohabiting heterosexual couple in precisely the same way that we would treat a cohabiting homosexual couple, because we recognize that the only appropriate context for sexual activity is heterosexual marriage.
And you would say these aren't laws and regulations or opinions that you've made up. These are biblical, and you're just following the biblical principles. And it's completely up to people in society whether or not they want to subscribe to that view as well.
Absolutely right, yeah.
And I listened to the debate, as I said, and the vote seemed to be pretty much overwhelming in support of the change. But there were some people who spoke very coherently against it. And I'm just wondering how many people in the Church of Wales feel the same as you? How many congregations? And what's the thinking then around those congregations now? How do you go forward?
That's a great question. So firstly, just going back to the vote, it wasn't quite as overwhelming as one might think. The House of Bishops were unanimously in favour. Laity, I think it was 49 votes in favour, 10 against. But actually in the House of Clergy, it was 28 in favour and 12 against. It was actually a much closer run thing, because had they had a few more votes, then the legislation couldn't have passed, because a 2/3 majority was required. And actually what that shows is there are quite a few who are concerned with the step that the Church in Wales has taken, both clergy and laity. I think now really is a time in which people are taking stock. I think some people may certainly well leave. And so my concern is that while some people may leave and some clergy may resign, we're unlikely to see churches leaving en masse.
So what advice would you give to people who are hearing about this news, who are concerned as to what they do, what they think, where they go, what happens now? Maybe even people in the wider Anglican service, if you like. Of course, the Church of England is debating these matters and discussing these matters, living in love and faith, isn't it? A big document that's being discussed. What advice would you give to people in the wider Anglican ministry and to people in the Church in Wales now?
Well, perhaps I could start with people in the Church in Wales first. There are organisations there who are orthodox and want to stand for truth in this context. And I'm thinking there particularly of two organisations, the Evangelical Fellowship of the Church in Wales, or EFCW, which was founded by John Stott just over 50 years ago. The other organisation is Anglican Essentials Wales, which had a conference just a couple of years ago. And they are slightly different to the Evangelical Fellowship of the Church in Wales in that they're a broader Orthodox coalition. So they welcome people from all traditions in the Anglican Church. I suspect there are many people who have been lifelong Anglicans, who are concerned about everything that is happening around them, who feel perhaps like they're the odd one out because society seems to be changing, but they've read the Bible and they say, well, this seems to say something different, and they're uncomfortable with the change. And it's those people I think I'm particularly concerned about. And it's those people that these two organizations would want to really draw alongside and support and encourage. We must engage. We must allow our voice to be heard. I think one of the great problems in the past, speaking particularly as an evangelical, is that we have tended to focus on life within our own parishes and not wanted to get involved in the broader governance of the church. And as a result, our voice hasn't been heard, I think, as it should have done. It was great to see people at governing body last week speaking out in a very difficult context. But actually, we should have been speaking out much earlier on. And then when legislation goes through, I think probably don't panic. I think the great danger is that we can have a knee-jerk response and rush to act quickly. I don't think we should. I think we should be careful. We should be considered. I think we should confer together and together seek the way forward. And then finally, we should all be prepared to stand firm for what we believe is right. Marriage is coming under increasing threat, and it takes an increasing amount of courage to stand up in the public square for marriage as is defined by the Bible. But I think, therefore, I think, therefore, we should stand firm and be ready to screw up our courage and stand up for what we believe.
Jim, that's excellent. I think we've covered the ground marvelously. Can I thank you very much for your stand? Can I thank you for joining us today? And can I wish you every best hope for the future ahead? Jim Griffiths, Reverend Jim Griffiths, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.